Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Mhm.
Today we're taking a look at some stories that you might not be seeing in your usual headlines,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean they aren't important. We've got some potential trade wars, brewing a court case with some serious implications, a controversial construction project, and even some political maneuvering in the Middle East.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
We do. Let's jump right in, shall we? First up, we've got former President Trump shaking things up again.
Oh, yeah. Never a dull moment with him, is there?
Not at all. So he's proposing a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico. Now, what's interesting here is that the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, that's CUSMA, is up for review in 2026.
Right.
But some experts think Trump might not be willing to wait that long.
Yeah, Greta Peisch, who was the general counsel for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, has said publicly that she doesn't think he'll wait the year to review the agreement.
Well,
Yeah, and Meredith Lilly, a professor at Carleton University, she points out that Canada has been getting ready for the CUSMA review. But these tariff threats, they make it a lot harder for both Canada and Mexico to negotiate.
that makes sense.
Uh,
It's like trying to have a conversation with a gun to your head.
Exactly. How can you expect to negotiate a fair trade deal when you're constantly under threat? It's just not a level playing field.
So do you think this could actually escalate into a full-blown trade war? I mean, what are the consequences if that happens?
Well, it's definitely a possibility. And history shows us that trade wars rarely have any real winners. Everyone ends up losing in some way. Supply chains get disrupted, prices go up for consumers, and even diplomatic relationships can be damaged.
Yeah, it's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It affects real people's lives.
Exactly. Think about it. For our listeners, this could mean paying more for everyday things, having fewer choices at the store, and maybe even worrying about their jobs if certain industries take a hit.
That's a scary thought. It's a good reminder that these global events, they have real consequences for all of us.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about a story that highlights another type of consequence. This time, it's within the U.S. justice system. The former district attorney in Georgia, Jackie Johnson, is finally going on trial.
Oh, right, the Ahmaud Arbery case.
Yes, this trial is important because it's about holding people in the justice system accountable for their actions. Johnson is accused of violating her oath of office and obstructing the investigation into Arbery's death.
And just as a reminder for our listeners, the three men who actually killed Arbery Gregg and Travis McMichael and their neighbor Roddy Bryan, they've already been found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.
Right, but the question here is, did Johnson use her position to protect Greg McMichael? Because he used to work for her as an investigator, and this trial has been delayed for over 3 years.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. I think part of the delay was because her lead attorney was involved in another high-profile case that was getting a lot of media attention.
Exactly, and all that delay has just made people more frustrated and distrustful. It raises some serious questions. If people in power can obstruct justice, what does that say about the fairness of the system?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if things would have been different if there hadn't been those potential conflicts of interest.
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely casts a shadow over the whole case.
This case really makes us look at the justice system and how it actually works in practice. It's not always as simple as we'd like to think.
You're right. It's a reminder that the fight for justice can be long and complicated. But for now, let's shift gears and head over to London. There's a construction project there that's causing quite a stir.
Oh yeah, I read something about that. What is it, a new skyscraper or something?
Even bigger than that, China is planning to build a new embassy in London. And get this, it's going to cover over 20,000 square meters.
Wow, that's huge. No wonder people are upset. What are they so worried about?
Well, there are a few things. Firstly, there are security concerns. A bigger embassy could mean more surveillance, and people are worried about potential disruptions in the area. There's also the issue of its location. The embassy is going to be near some historical sites, and people are worried about the construction damaging or blocking the view of those landmarks.
So it's a clash between diplomatic interests and preserving the history and character of the neighborhood.
Exactly. And it puts the UK government in a tough spot. They want to maintain good relations with China, which is a major world power, but they also need to listen to the concerns of their own citizens.
I bet that's causing some headaches for them.
You can say that again. Even the Metropolitan Police initially objected to the project because of security risks.
Really?
Yeah, but they've since withdrawn their objection, saying they've figured out ways to handle potential protests without causing too much traffic disruption.
Okay, but I imagine a lot of residents are still not happy about it.
You're right. Many of them remain unconvinced that it's a good idea.
It's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. What about those UK ministers, Yvette Cooper and David Lammy? they've expressed support for the project, right?
Yeah, they have, and it really shows just how complicated international relations can be. The UK government has to consider the potential economic and diplomatic benefits of having a strong relationship with China, but at the same time, they can't ignore the concerns of their own people.
It's a balancing act, for sure. It makes you think about how we balance those competing interests as a country. How much weight do we give to local concerns when we're dealing with international diplomacy?
That's a really good question, and it's one that doesn't have an easy answer. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment, but we'll be back after the break to continue our deep dive into these stories and explore their potential implications. Stay with us. So we're back and ready to dig a little deeper into these stories. We were talking about some pretty heavy stuff before the break, like former President Trump's involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah. It's definitely a lot to unpack. This conflict has been going on for so long, and it's just so incredibly complicated. There's so much history and mistrust on both sides.
Exactly. And if what's being reported is true, Trump's actions could actually make things even worse. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire.
What kind of consequences could we see?
Well, for one, encouraging Israel to violate a ceasefire could lead to more violence. It also undermines all the people who are working towards a peaceful solution.
Right. Makes sense.
And then there's the issue of canceling sanctions on Israeli settlers and some far-right groups that could embolden those who don't want a two-state solution and make it even harder to find common ground.
Yeah, it almost feels like we're going backwards instead of forward.
That's a good way to put it. And what about his challenge to the International Criminal Court's arrest warrants?
Yeah, what's that all about?
Well, the ICC was created to hold people accountable for the worst crimes, like genocide and war crimes. It doesn't matter what your political status is. So, by challenging those warrants, Trump is basically saying that international law doesn't apply in this situation.
Wow, that's a bold move to say the least.
It is, and it could set a dangerous precedent.
Yeah.
You know, if other countries or leaders see this and think they can just ignore international courts or agreements, that's a problem.
It undermines the whole system.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if those mechanisms for international justice can really work if powerful people can just bypass them.
This situation really shows how everything is connected. Actions in one part of the world can have consequences everywhere.
It's a ripple effect for sure. And it raises some big questions about the U.S.'s role in all this. I mean, should we still be trying to mediate this conflict?
It's a good question. We've played a big role in the past, but our influence has definitely weakened in recent years.
Especially given everything that's happened recently with Trump and the current political climate. It's hard to say what our role should be or if we can even be effective at this point.
It's a tough situation for sure. But let's shift gears for a second. What do you think is motivating Trump to get involved in all these global issues again? Is he really trying to make a difference, or is there something else going on?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's hard to say for sure what's going on in his head.
Right.
Some people say he genuinely believes he can solve these problems, that he's a deal maker, even on an international scale.
Others might say he's just trying to stay relevant, to hold on to some of that power and influence, even though he's not in office anymore.
Yeah, and then there are those who think he just loves the attention. He thrives on controversy and chaos.
It's probably a mix of all of those things, to be honest.
Probably. But the bottom line is his actions have consequences, whether he intends them or not.
Exactly. We can't just dismiss him as irrelevant. His legacy is still shaping the world we live in.
And it's up to us to pay attention, to analyze what he's doing, and understand the potential impact.
Well said. Okay, let's circle back to that controversial embassy project in London. What do you think this situation says about the relationship between the UK and China?
I think it really highlights the challenges they're facing. On the one hand, the UK sees China as a major economic partner. They want to keep those diplomatic ties strong and encourage trade.
But at the same time, they're also worried about China's human rights record, their aggressive foreign policy, and their growing influence.
Right. It's a balancing act, for sure. They're trying to figure out how to benefit from China's economic growth without compromising their own values and security.
And this embassy project has become a symbol of all that tension.
It's a very visible reminder of China's growing presence in the UK.
And it's forcing the UK to confront some tough questions about their relationship with China and their place in the world.
Exactly. They're trying to find their footing in a world where China is becoming more and more powerful.
And a lot of other countries are in the same boat. They're trying to figure out how to engage with China without getting burned.
It's a global challenge for sure. It shows just how interconnected we all are.
What happens in one place can have consequences everywhere. Okay, let's talk about those trade tensions between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. What's behind all this focus on tariffs and trade agreements?
Well, there are a few things going on. Firstly, there's a rise in economic nationalism in a lot of countries, including the U.S.
Right. People are worried about losing their jobs. They think other countries aren't playing fair, and they want to protect domestic industries.
And we've seen this play out with the rise of populism and protectionist policies.
People are starting to question the benefits of globalization and free trade.
And the COVID-19 pandemic didn't help. It disrupted supply chains and showed us how risky it can be to rely on other countries for essential things.
So it's like a perfect storm of economic anxieties and global disruptions.
Exactly. And in the case of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, there are also some specific concerns about this CUSMA agreement.
Some people think it needs to be renegotiated.
They argue that it's not protecting American jobs and that it's not working as intended.
And then you've got Trump throwing a wrench in the works.
Oh, yeah. He's still a major factor, even though he's not in office anymore.
His influence is still strong, especially with his base.
And his actions on trade have a huge impact. We need to understand what's motivating him and what the potential consequences are.
It's never simple with him, is it?
Never. Okay, so what are the arguments in favor of tariffs? Are they valid?
Well, people who support tariffs say that they protect domestic industries, create jobs, and bring in money for the government.
They also say that tariffs can be used as leverage in trade negotiations.
Like a bargaining chip.
Right. But those arguments often ignore the downsides.
Like higher prices for consumers,
Mm-hmm.
retaliatory tariffs from other countries, and damage to international trade relationships.
Right. Tariffs are a blunt instrument. They can have a lot of unintended consequences.
It's not a simple issue.
Not at all.
Mm.
We need to think critically about economic policy and not just fall for easy answers or slogans.
We need to look at the big picture and weigh the costs and benefits carefully.
And we need to talk about these issues in a way that's informed and respectful. Taking into account different perspectives and looking at the evidence.
It's not about picking sides. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly. And speaking of finding solutions, let's move on to our final story. The trial of former District Attorney Jackie Johnson.
Okay, so let's talk about that last story. The trial of Jackie Johnson, the former district attorney in Georgia. This case is getting a lot of attention, and for good reason.
It really highlights some major issues in our justice system. Racial justice, prosecutorial accountability, the whole idea of fairness.
Yeah. It's been over 3 years since Arbery was killed, and now the former DA is finally going on trial. It's a long time coming.
And it makes you think about justice delayed, justice denied.
It does. It's hard not to see the racial dynamics in this case.
Yeah.
I mean, a black man jogging through a mostly white neighborhood gets chased down and killed by 3 white men. And then the initial response from law enforcement was just so slow, it makes you wonder if things would have been different if Arbery had been white.
It's a valid question. The case sparked outrage and protests across the country. It really brought to light the racial disparities in our justice system. And then when you add in the accusation that the former DA actually tried to hinder the investigation, well, it just adds fuel to the fire.
Yeah, it raises serious questions about whether she would have acted the same way if Arbery had been a white man.
Exactly. And these are uncomfortable questions, but we need to ask them if we want to address the root causes of these injustices.
This trial isn't just about one person. It's about the whole system.
It's about holding people in power accountable no matter who they are.
And it's about sending a message that everyone deserves equal justice under the law.
The outcome of this trial will have a ripple effect. It could lead to real change in the justice system, or it could reinforce the idea that some people are above the law.
It's a pivotal moment. It's about more than just this one case. It's about the bigger conversation about race and justice in America.
And that conversation needs to continue even after the trial is over.
Absolutely. We need to talk openly and honestly about race privilege and how our systems can perpetuate inequality.
It's not enough to just acknowledge the problem. We have to be actively involved in finding solutions. We need to challenge the status quo and work to create a more just world.
Well said. And that's what we've tried to do today with this deep dive, to shine a light on these important stories that might be flying under the radar.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from potential trade wars to international relations to the fight for justice here at home.
And these stories remind us that we're all connected in ways we might not realize. What happens in one part of the world can have an impact on all of us.
So we encourage you to stay curious, keep learning, and engage with the world around you. These stories matter, and your voice matters too.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.